Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Gaming Telecom video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be starting things out with Intel, as the company have updated their software developers manual with clarifying language. This is, of course, in reaction to the startling revelation that operating system developers misunderstood what the manual said, and therefore a plethora of operating systems have major bugs related to security. Then we're going to move over to Sony, as the company have dashed the hopes of many by confirming that we will not be seeing the PlayStation 5 at E3 2018. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the video discussing an upcoming AMD GPU architecture. This is most likely post-Navi, and patents tell us it's going to be rather different from the current GPUs that AMD are making, and it could make for rather interesting gains in not just gaming, but also for compute-orientated tasks. And well, it's just very exciting stuff. But as I said, first things first, our chums over at Intel. Of course, the CPU industry has been rocked with various security exploits. These include Spectre and Meltdown. Currently, Intel are also trying to patch next generation Spectre, but perhaps one of the most startling revelations in the security fiasco was not actually caused by Intel or AMD themselves, or a bug of any traditional sort. Instead, it was just, well, pretty much every software developer ever misreading a manual. So this affected Windows, Linux, Mac OS, and certain implementations of Zen, and even some virtual machine software as well. So Intel have decided to update their software developers manual. Intel have released a quote: "The security of our customers and partners is important to us. To help ensure clear communication with the developer community, we are updating our software developers manual, SDM, with clarifying language on the secure use of the pop/move SS instructions. We recommend that system software vendors evaluate their software to confirm their products handle these situations in question. More information is available," and then they provide a link. I will, of course, plonk that into the video description. Just as a reminder, this vulnerability exists because operating system vendors misinterpreted a hardware debug mechanism, and this once again is for Intel x86/64 architectures. They didn't make a mistake in terms of how they coded it. Instead, they made a mistake in that they misunderstood how this function actually operated. The best analogy for this is that if you had someone painting your wall, they didn't screw up the paint job. Instead, they just painted it the wrong color because they misunderstood what color you actually told them. So don't forget that this was a pretty major problem as well, because hackers could actually gain access to sensitive memory information or actually control low-level operating system functions. Fortunately, patches are rolling out, so the normal suggestions would apply. Make sure that, of course, you update your machine, don't leave your laptop unattended for long periods of time, and so on and so on. Meanwhile, for those hoping to see the PlayStation 5 appearing at E3 2018, Sean Layden, who is of course SIE Worldwide Studio Head, has nuked any hope that we will actually be seeing that. He says, and I quote, "We're going to be focusing on our great content. There will be no new hardware announcements at E3 this year. You heard it here first," end quote. So this also, of course, dashes any hopes of seeing, let's say, a new PlayStation Vita, where there are some rumours that we will be seeing a next handheld from Sony. If that is the case, it certainly won't be now. And honestly, it just makes sense. I mean, the PlayStation 4 Pro is not exactly long in the tooth. It's only been out for a short period of time in the grand scheme of things. And considering most of the rumours are telling us that the PlayStation 5 is not going to really start to kind of gain momentum until 2019. That's when the earliest speculation is that it's going to be released, and I wouldn't even be surprised if it's 2020. I mean, after all, that is not that long into the future now. It's only about a year and a half. I wouldn't be surprised if we see it kind of released early 2020 or possibly Christmas period 2020. I don't think it's going to hit mid-year or anything like that. So it's going to be very curious, especially given the PlayStation 4 is still selling like hotcakes. It is, without any question, very much outselling the Xbox at the moment. And I'm probably just going to echo exactly what everyone else and their mothers said. That's really the fault of Microsoft. I think that when we start seeing Microsoft churn out better first-party stuff, it might help the Xbox to gain some ground. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your perspective, Microsoft are not a console brand. They are Microsoft. Xbox is a brand of, well, you know, Microsoft. Microsoft is not a brand of Xbox. And I know that's a really silly thing to say, but the reason I'm bringing that up is because Microsoft don't necessarily care if you're playing, let's say, the latest Halo or Gears of War or whatever on the PC, as long as it's Windows, or on the Xbox, because ultimately they just want you part of the ecosystem. However, I will completely and utterly back everyone who said that Microsoft do need to improve their first-party lineup, and according to the rumours that we've heard, well, that is going to be a thing. Microsoft are apparently setting up numerous studios, and of course we've seen a lot of people move to there, and Microsoft are definitely being very aggressive when it comes to purchases, so we'll just have to wait and see. Meanwhile, continuing with what Sean has said, over at Sony, they have also said that they want to continue to reignite the press conference at E3, and apparently we're going to see a big deep dive on 4 of their upcoming titles. These will be Death Stranding, Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima, and finally The Last of Us Part 2. And final piece of news / analysis is AMD's next generation GPU. From what we can understand, it is known as a Super Single Instruction Multi-Data, Super SIMD if you prefer, graphics processing unit. There is a patent that was filed in November 2016, but it has only just been published a few days ago, and it's fairly obvious that we're dealing with an advanced architecture that's definitely post-Vega and likely post-Navi. From the January 2018 GPU Roadmap that AMD have released, we see that there are 2 Vega GPUs listed. The first, of course, is the 14nm Vega that was currently available to customers, with the 7nm Vega 20 designed around machine learning being tested right now, but not currently available for release. AMD will be following that up with Navi, which we know is both scalable and incorporates next generation memory, which we now know of course is likely GDDR6 or HBM2. This new architecture, however, is very exciting and should provide the best of both worlds between very long instruction word VLIW and SIMD, single instruction multi-data, in effect being the next evolution of AMD GPUs. Because this topic is pretty complicated, we'll establish the basics of VLIW and SIMD, then we'll proceed to speculate over the pattern. Please note that this is not a full analysis video, and thus I will be simplifying things just a little. Unfortunately, I'm currently in the midst of reviewing both a Ryzen 7 2700X and an X470 motherboard, plus as well I have a few other obligations in reviews and other content that I need to produce, so I don't have the time for a full analysis video today. I will certainly be going into some in-depth stuff, but just not as in-depth as I traditionally would. But if folks do want one, if you do want one, let me know and I will work on one. So while video cards aren't a new invention, and indeed have become very popular since the late 90s, with the 3DFX Voodoo range of course really spurring things on, there have been several eras to them. The first was essentially there to handle texture work, basic lighting effects and so on, such as the Voodoos. Later we got hardware triangle lighting setup, the GeForce original 256, and slowly GPUs continued to evolve and get rid of fixed function parts and instead were designed around the idea of having stream processors that will be able to process a large variety of work, be they graphics, physics or anything else needed by the application. Slowly of course this shifted to compute. Currently, AMD GPUs use GCN, or Graphics Core Next, or in the case of Vega, Next Generation Compute Unit, NCU if you prefer. Now, GCN debuted back in 2011 with Southern Islands. This was also known as the Radeon HD 7000 series. So first, let's establish the basis to which GCN differs from its predecessor known as Terascale. VLIW, which Terascale was based on, allows an application to specify instructions in parallel and reduce the complexity of design of the GPU. Using the Cayman Islands VLIW4 as an example, each SP, streaming processor, would have 4 fundamental math units and they would execute instructions in parallel over as many clock cycles as necessary. To clarify, clock cycles would mean GPU core clock cycles. VLIW break instructions into groups, and those are known as wavefronts. These wavefronts still exist today with GCN, although the number of instructions in a wavefront has differed depending upon the GPU, but if you're still confused, just think of a wavefront as a bunch of instructions. The great benefit of VLIW is that it reduces the complexity of the GPU chip, as there are less transistors and typically they put out less heat and require less power consumption. Unfortunately, they are also not the best for GPU workloads, and it's harder for the VLIW to be scheduled ahead of time in its workload, and with AMD's case it's easy for it to compile graphics shaders, but it wasn't so easy to compile things for compute. And it also meant that a lot of the optimization was actually down to the compiler itself, and this is particularly even more true with compute functions, therefore optimization was an absolute nightmare. If you want to do a lot of highly parallel workloads, then very long instruction words are absolutely the best, and if you want to use them however for compute-based architectures, then you start to limit yourself. So now that we've gone over the basics, what exactly does this patent show? Well, in a nutshell, it demonstrates that this new architecture, Super SIMD, is a cross between GCN, Terascale, and even a little bit of AMD's older Bulldozer CPU architecture thrown in for good measure. If you read a few sentences from AMD's own patent, it gives us a few insights in this. This does get pretty technical, but I explain some of it in just a moment. However, for those who have a brain for this, you're going to find it rather interesting. The Super SIMD structure is capable of executing more than one instruction from a single or multi-thread and includes plurality of vector general purpose registers, VGPRs, a first arithmetic logic unit, ALU, and the first ALU coupled to the polarity of VGPRs, a second ALU, the second ALU coupled to the polarity of VGPRs, and destination cache that is coupled via bypass and forwarding logic to the first ALU, and the second ALU receiving an output of the first ALU and the second ALU. The first ALU can be a full ALU, and the second ALU can be a core ALU. End quote. Gee, Paul, I can hear you scream over the internets. That cleared things up just spiffily. Okay, so what exactly does this mean? Well, to summarize, there are two ALUs. Each ALU has a sister ALU which resides directly next to it. These ALUs seem to be configurable with different variants of the Super SIMD architecture, and this means you can have full ALUs, side ALUs, core ALUs, or transcender ALUs in different configurations. We can guess that the full ALU is vectorized and core ALUs aren't clearly defined. We can make some assumptions and some educated guesses that they're just a few of the most common instructions, and that's what they're designed to execute. Indeed, in the documentation it does mention that certain opcode is an opcode that is executed by a core ALU. If you're unfamiliar, opcode is something which tells the CPU/piece of hardware which job it needs to be performed. There's also a transcendental ALU, which we can guess would be for complex longer form operations such as sin and square root. These two ALUs are controlled by a very long instruction word to, instruction. And if you need that translated, it's simply a larger instruction which contains individual instructions for each of the two ALUs. These two ALUs are connected to a destination operand cache. This is pretty cool because it allows extreme flexibility. It allows the chaining of instructions, at least in theory from what we can gather here, from one ALU to its sister ALU without passing the instruction back to level 1 cache, thus increasing its latency. And also, of course, eating up bandwidth on the actual GPU itself. The patent actually describes a scenario where two multiply add instructions are executed on a single ALU. Let's call that ALU A, and then directly past ALU B, its sister, for comparison. Reading out another section of the patent, it says Super SIMD blocks include vector execution units. Each vector execution units include two sets of core ALUs, we know that, and there's also one side set of ALUs, each having n number of ALUs equal to the SIMD width. Side ALUs do not have multipliers, but could help to implement all non-essential operations like conversions of instructions. Side ALUs could co-work with any one core ALU to finish complex operations like transcendental instructions. We could certainly go a lot deeper in the technical aspect here, and I plan to do so soon, but this is a news-focused piece, and as I mentioned earlier, I need to put a lot of work into this to really do it the justice it would deserve if you wanted me to go into a full in-depth explanation for all of this. But what we can certainly do is to go into healthy speculation and some thought process. One of the things that immediately struck me with the filing timing of this is that this GPU project directly would have involved Raja Koduri, who is of course now departed for pastures Intel. Don't forget, Polaris and Vega were largely inherited by him. He of course had some influence without any question, but this, at least in theory, would be the first GPU architecture designed from scratch with him at the helm. And we can also presume it would be the last he also spearheads. It'll be interesting to see what knowledge and what he's learned from this and what he'll be doing at Intel with, of course, its two GPUs, Jupiter and Arctic Sounds. And the next thing is that real-time ray tracing in games is certainly a big idea and definitely something we're going to be seeing more common over the next several years. But, of course, it's also very intensive. It requires a lot of oomph to run. But we can presume that given the supposed time frame of the release of this GPU architecture, after all, it looks like Navi is 2019-ish, possibly 2020, meaning this is, let's face it, 2020 or 2021, it would also fit rather nicely with Epic Games' Tim Sweeney, who has predicted real-time ray tracing to become more common within games around this time frame. In other words, I wouldn't be surprised if some of this would actually make a lot of sense. After all, the architecture with VLIW and SIMD would lend itself rather well to ray tracing. And don't forget that real-time ray tracing is now a thing for some mobile GPUs. Of course, that's not to say that the architecture is identical, but it has been demonstrated, that is, real-time ray tracing, with the PowerVR Wizard GPU, and it ran the apartment demo, which is using OpenGL ES ray tracing. Of course, the frame rate is not ideal, and yes, of course, the level of detail is not what you would expect for, let's put it this way, ray tracing, but that's not necessarily the point. It's certainly a good proof of concept, and when you also consider mobile GPU makers don't feel that you're going to be utilizing Android for compute-based tasks. They don't think that you're going to be doing physics or whatever. Therefore, they often use variants of very long instruction words, such as the Qualcomm Adreno GPUs. Of course, there is a lot more we could certainly say about this, and ultimately a lot of this is based upon a filing of a patent, and it is certainly not necessarily that this is confirmed to be the next GPU architecture. After all, perhaps whomever created this then had a better idea, or perhaps someone else had a better idea 3 minutes later, and therefore that got filed. But let's face it, this is very likely to be the basis, perhaps not necessarily the entire thing, but the basis of a new architecture. The problem is, compute work is, well, popular, and yes, I'm being very, very, very understated with that. Unfortunately, it's also a bit of a nightmare because that means that companies have a couple of choices. The first choice is they develop an architecture specifically around gaming. The second is that they would develop an architecture specifically around compute. Or the third is that they try to develop an architecture which is, for lack of a better word, a mixture of both, and that's what AMD and Nvidia are trying now. Of course, they make some changes. For example, they might reduce the floating point performance on a GeForce graphics card so it doesn't eat into the sales of their Quadros or whatever, but you get the general gist of things. With this, at least with different configurations, and from what we're understanding about AMD's Lego philosophy, it should be very possible for AMD to produce a GPU which, at least in theory, is very scalable and very tweakable. Of course, all of this ultimately is down to AMD and how developers decide to utilize the GPU. And that's the other thing as well. We can assume that GCN will map rather well to this because, of course, it does have a lot of GCN functionality. Therefore, it's not like if you've bought a game which heavily uses DX12 on, let's say, Polaris now, it's not going to suddenly just crash when you try to use it on one of these. But with that said, it also has the possibility of being very optimizable for the next generation, and that really is what we're coming down to. We, as members of the press and even gamers, we don't necessarily know what's coming 2, 3, 4, 5 years into the future. Ultimately, these companies are thinking the long-term roadmap, and I believe that this was succinctly put actually by the investment arm at Intel a couple of days ago when I was doing a story. They don't have tomorrow in their mind, they are thinking 5 or 10 years ahead, and of course that's going to be paramount for companies. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon, take care of yourselves, bye for now.